All right, this is the second video lecture on Book 1 of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. And what you're seeing on the screen is a conceptual map of important Book 1 arguments and concepts, and we'll work through a chunk of this map to discuss how the various concepts and arguments connect with one another. And you can also see that the map is color-coded, where the colors indicate what chapter from Book 1 those arguments and concepts can be found. So let's begin with the concept of the good. Aristotle's earliest explanation of the good is simply that at which all things aim, right? The good is that at which all of our desires and choices and decisions are aiming. Now, if it's the case that there is some one ultimate goal of human life, then the attempt to attain this goal will motivate everything we do and every choice we make. So we better figure out what exactly the good is. And that's the task of moral philosophy generally. And specifically, it's the task of value theory, one of the main areas of ethics we discussed in the text. What is ethics? A collection of introductions to moral philosophy. All right, Aristotle says, look, we all agree. The ultimate goal in life is eudaimonia. Human flourishing, living well, and doing well, right? As opposed to the English language kind of concept of happiness as feeling good. But there's another way to define the good that connects it to another important concept. The good is that telos, for the sake of which we do everything we do in life. Where telos means end, goal, aim, purpose, or even reason. And this brings us to the concept of teleology, right? Teleology is the study of the different goals and purposes that belong to things in nature, including human beings, and guide their development through life. So Aristotle's ethics is teleological. He argues that everything in the world, from the smallest acorn to the human being, moves through the world according to this logic of self-actualization, right? The natural motivation to actualize or to attain the ultimate goal that is shared by every member of that species. In chapter 2, Aristotle makes the point that politics is the science of the good. This is because politics is the art that investigates how a society should be arranged to promote the good for the individual and the community. And we'll come back to the question of politics later in the video, but for now, let's think more on this concept of telos. So every single thing you do in life has a telos, a purpose or a goal. Now, some things you do in life are simply a means to an end. When we do something as a means to an end, we aren't doing it for its own sake. Rather, it's something we do because doing it's necessary in order to attain something else. And that something else is the goal, right? The telos of the activity. So, studying for your math test is probably a means to an end activity because you probably aren't studying math because you just cherish the experience. Rather, you do it because it's necessary for passing the course. And passing the math course is the telos of studying, right? And of course, passing the math class has its own telos, right? Earning your degree. Similarly, working fast food is probably just another means to an end, right? The reason and the goal for showing up to work is getting paid, right? That's the telos, right? So in means to end activities, the goal of the activity is outside of the activity itself. Of course, not everything we do in life is merely a means to an end. We do many activities for no other reason than the fact that we enjoy doing them, right? They are valuable in themselves. These are the ends in themselves activities, right? The end here is like the goal, right? The goal in itself activity. The activity is its own goal, right? Now, the telos of these activities, the reason you do them, simply the activity itself. And we can think of plenty of different examples, right? Think of your hobbies, things that you do just to have fun. And maybe that will include experiencing nature, right? Kayaking at sunset, playing music, right? Anything that allows you to take pleasure in existence, which might include reading a book by your favorite author in the rain, or spending the afternoon fishing, painting, or doing anything, artistic. Also, camping with your partner, road tripping with your best friends, spending time with your family and your loved ones are all ends in themselves activities. Now, obviously, there are countless ends in themselves activities that we pursue in life. And Aristotle has told us that the attempt to attain the good is the reason we do everything we do, right? And he means everything. All of our ends in themselves activities and all of our means to end activities, everything ultimately aims toward the good, because that's the definition of the good, that at which all things aim. And I mean, this should sound very strange at first, because we might say, yeah, don't we do all sorts of mundane stuff all the time that has nothing really at all to do with happiness or human flourishing, right? So yeah, we might say to Aristotle, sure, the reason I asked my girlfriend to marry me is because it makes me happy, but is Aristotle suggesting also that the reason I put gas in my car is because I'm trying to flourish, right? How can it be that brushing my teeth and studying for my math exam are done for the same reasons that I got married, which is what this argument suggests. So we can hone in on this example of going to math class to try to demonstrate why it is done for the same reason ultimately that you get married, right? For the sake of living happily. Now, sure, you may not be experiencing any great happiness while you're in math class, but if you take a reflective moment to consider why you're there, you realize that going to math class is a necessary means to earn a good grade, which in turn is a necessary means to getting your degree, which you do for the sake of landing a career better than McDonald's, which is necessary for buying a home that's adequate to raising a family, which many of us believe is a necessary ingredient for living happily, right? Which is, again, what we mean by the good. So we can see, take any particular action, no matter how mundane or trivial, and you can kind of chase its intermediate goals, right? All the way to happiness. So, in other words, the reason you go to math class, even if it makes you miserable while you're there, is paradoxically because you're trying to live happily. And failing math class is totally inconsistent with trying to pursue that particular goal. Now, all of our activities and choices have as their goal this ultimate end in itself, right? Again, the good is the telos for the sake of which we do everything we do. What we choose to do is something that we think will make us happy in the present moment, or it's something that we choose to do because we think it will put us in a better position to be happy in the future, even if the activity makes us unhappy in the present moment. Now, someone might ask, yeah, but, why do we want happiness? What if someone didn't want to be happy? And this is, to some extent, a sort of nonsense question. If someone wanted to be unhappy, it's because they are sick, right? Damaged, unwell. Aristotle would even go so far as to say they aren't being fully human. They are psychologically defective in some sense, right? Because Aristotle's ethics is teleological, right? The purpose of a human life, the ultimate goal, the natural motivation is to pursue happiness, right? So if you're no longer pursuing happiness, you've been kind of alienated from your own species being, your own essence, as it were, right? According to the way Aristotle's teleological ethics works. All right. Moving on to chapter 5, the arguments here in green, Aristotle recognizes that there is a sort of mass confusion and disagreement about what specifically the good life looks like. He analyzes 3 forms of life that are commonly associated with the good life: the pleasure-seeking life, the political or honor-seeking life, the contemplative life, and then he also addresses the wealth-seeking life. And it's important you understand his arguments why each of these views of the good life all fall short. First is the pleasure-seeking life, right? This is the life of hedonism, pursuing maximum bodily pleasure, enjoyment, and entertainment, right? And we can imagine this as the lifestyle we associate with the rich and famous. Wealth, sex, food, drugs, shopping, luxury, vacations, materialism, consumerism. Aristotle says most people identify the pleasure-filled life with the truly good life, right? And it's a question you can ask yourself. If you could have any life you wanted at the snap of your fingers, would you wish for the life of maximum pleasure and enjoyment, right? Having countless beautiful lovers, an endless wardrobe, luxury sports cars, every techno commodity your heart desires, the most beautiful vacation homes scattered across the most beautiful places in the world, the most delicious foods brought to you whenever you desired, and of course staff to do all of the cleaning and the chores and so on. Aristotle's argument, though, is simple. If this sort of hedonism is what you associate with the good life, then you have a shallow soul and a deeply impoverished conception of happiness in the good life. This is a life fit for beasts, Aristotle says, not humans. Because this form of life, this empty hedonism, has no higher aim than simple bodily or mindless pleasure, which is how animals live. All right, next is the political life, or the honor-seeking life, right? The life of maximum reputation and admiration. Right, this is sought by the sophisticated, cultured, and educated types. So you're a leader in society who's praised and admired, you command respect, right? Your view matters more than others when important decisions need to be made. Now, Aristotle identifies two reasons that this also is a superficial account of the highest good. The first reason is that the honor-seeking person's happiness would be totally dependent on others, namely those who praise and honor you. But true happiness, true eudaimonia, isn't based on something which can be taken away so easily. For instance, because you had a hot take that got you canceled and now you've stopped receiving praise, and then along with it erodes, right, your ability and capacity to be happy and live well. Happiness can't be taken away so easily, right? Now, the second reason Aristotle identifies is that the honor-seeking person still wants to be honored because they are virtuous, right? Because of their moral excellence, their wisdom, and their character. Therefore, even those who seek honor above all else have to admit that having an excellent moral character is actually preferable to simply being honored, right? Why? Well, for the simple reason that it is on this basis that they want to be honored in the first place, right? On the basis of their character. All right, third is the life of contemplation, or the enlightenment-seeking life. This is the life of maximum wisdom and knowledge. And Aristotle doesn't address this topic until Book 10 of the Nicomachean Ethics, which we have not read, but I'll summarize it here briefly because it's just fascinating. So, imagine the enlightenment-seeking person as someone who, withdraws from the muck and mire of life and politics and instead just seeks wisdom or God or truth removed from society. Now, essentially, Aristotle will say, kind of paradoxically, that enlightenment is the highest good. But this is a life that is fit for the gods, not for human beings, right? And of course, what he says is that because human beings have reason, we have within us a spark of divinity. And it's that spark of divinity, the spark of the divine in us, that draws us to like the divine goods, like wisdom and knowledge. But as human beings, we have political work to do here, right? We can't just abandon our community, abandon that aspect that makes us human to go instead seek God and truth in the mountains or in the woods or so on. So we can see, right, the life of pleasure is, fit for beasts, while the life of just like enlightenment seeking is fit for the gods. And human beings, of course, are somewhere in the middle. But we have both the divine and the animalistic aspect in our souls, right? This is a kind of fascinating way that Aristotle thinks about human psychology. All right, now Aristotle very briefly considers the wealth-seeking life. This is the life of maximum money-making, and he also lays out why it fails to constitute the goal of the good life. He points out that wealth and its acquisition are not ends in themselves. Money, considered only in itself, is worthless, right? You can't eat it. It doesn't keep you warm. It's not going to provide you with friendship, right? The worth of money is purely a matter of exchanging it for those goods and values that are valuable in themselves. So you've got pleasure, honor, virtue, and wisdom. Those are at least goods that are valuable in themselves, though of course they aren't identifiable with the good itself. But wealth, on the other hand, wealth is merely a means to an end. Thus, the pursuit of money does not and cannot form the basis of the good life or the basis of eudaimonia. So because there's this mass disagreement and confusion about the nature of the good life, the nature of eudaimonia, Aristotle argues that progress is only going to be made on this front if we can discern what our human nature is, right? And so to be clear, Aristotle he's not a relativist about this. He doesn't look out and see that, oh, there's different philosophers and everyone disagrees about, what the highest good in life is. Therefore, the good is just whatever you think it is. Aristotle rejects that particular thesis. No, there is like a correct view about the nature of the good life. But to discern what it is, we have to understand something about human nature. The more we know about human nature, the better we can ascertain what it means to live well as humans, as nature intended. So, in other words, we can think of eudaimonia not merely as doing well, but as humaning well. And recall what Aristotle writes in chapter 7 of the text. He says a clearer account of happiness could be given if we could first ascertain the function of man, for the good and the well seem to reside in the proper function of a thing, if, of course, it has a function. All right, so this is a really important concept here that we have to learn. Aristotle has a functional conception of goodness. Something is good, in other words, because it excels at performing its natural function, human beings included. The important Greek concept here is ergon, the characteristic, species-specific activity of a thing. So let's take, for an example, a solar dehydrator, and you want to distinguish a good solar dehydrator from a defective one. What you have to know first is the purpose of the thing. You have to know its telos. And secondly, you have to be able to identify what its function is, right? The activity that it performs that allows it to fulfill its purpose. Now, the telos of this thing is to make dried fruits and vegetables, and its ergon, right? Its characteristic activity that allows it to do that is capturing energy from the sun and then using it to remove moisture from food. Okay, then, so thinking of that example as, helpful, what is the function of a human being that allows us to realize our telos, right? Which is eudaimonia. Well, Aristotle tells us in chapter 7, the human ergon is the activity of the rational element of the soul. And again, we've got a combination of two important Greek concepts. Energia looks like our English word energy, which means being at work or not dormant, and logos, which is reason or the rational part of the soul. So our ergon, right, our function, which allows us to fulfill our purpose, according to Aristotle, is the activity of reason to adopt worthwhile ends and improve ourselves, right? To analyze and guide our desires, to develop our character, to hone our talents, to deepen our intellectual capacities, altogether to use reason to build out our potential for excellence and flourish. And how does reason accomplish all this? Well, we have to see that Aristotle analyzes the soul into these two aspects here on the screen. First is the commanding aspect of rationality, right? That's logos proper, we might say, right? This is the faculty by which we think and reason and adopt those goals which will allow us to improve and grow, right? The second aspect of the rational part of the soul is what he calls the appetite of soul, right? This is what generates our appetites, our urges, and our longings. Now, the appetite of soul, it doesn't think or reason, but it is still partly rational insofar as it obeys reason and accepts the leadership of logos. So think of it like this. The soul of a good person, the person who humans well, is characterized by the creative use of reason as it organizes and arranges our appetite of soul like a great artist tending to his masterpiece, right? Which is a very deliberate, active, engaged way of living in the world, right? Because logos must be active. energia. Non-human animals, right, cannot rule over and organize their urges, their desires, and their goals like this. Much less can they do it creatively, right, having in sight a beautifully lived life. But humans, on the other hand, humans can go spelunking into the soul, where we discover the sort of vastness of our potential. Right? Instead of blindly obeying our impulses and pursuing whatever prefabricated desires are on offer in our society, we can instead discern our worthiest desires. We can envision the future we want, and then we can work to bring our habits and our goals into line with that vision. And we are all of us brimming with potential, right? There is a version of yourself that is not yet actual, but longs to be realized. The function of Logos is to sniff out that version of yourself, formulate the steps to take in order to actualize that potential, and then command ourselves to bring that version into existence over time. All right? This is the good. It's a lifelong project of eudaimonia and human flourishing. The spoudios, or the serious person, is Aristotle's name for the person who sets high standards for themselves and is excellent at the use of reason, right, again, to rule over their soul and build out that potential. Now, the next video lecture is going to go into a little bit more detail and flesh out the function argument and, think through Logos in more detail. But we're going to conclude now by looking back at the topic of politics. So Aristotle considers politics to be the master science of the good because the political art is the art of discerning how society should be arranged to promote human flourishing. So recall our plant life example from last lecture. In addition to performing photosynthesis, right, the plant ergon, what else do plants require in order to flourish? Right? Well, they need sunlight. They need nutrient-rich soil. They need plenty of water. In other words, plant life, in order to flourish, requires a nourishing environment. So the question for political philosophy is this: what is the nourishing infrastructure that the human society requires if it's to promote excellence among its members? And this nourishing infrastructure will include, but is not limited to, the questions of laws, right? What laws, if any, does the good society have? Also, what system of government, if any, does the good society have? And how much political power will we allow authorities to have in the society? Right? What resources are people entitled to, and how are these goods produced and distributed? Are the means of production privately owned, collectively owned, a mix of the two? Right? Should religion be cultivated in the good society? How much separation should exist between political authority and religious institutions? What behaviors, desires, and goals will the good society encourage and discourage? And what sort of knowledge does the good society produce, and how is it distributed, right? So this is the question of trying to discern the nourishing infrastructure which allows for eudaimonia. And there are just any number of examples of communities that have failed to meet even the most minimal requirements for human well-being. So we'll use two examples. First is Flint, Michigan. Consider growing up in Flint, Michigan, where in 2014, between 6,000 and 12,000 children were exposed to water with high levels of lead, right? The city of Flint poisoned its children, not because they hate children, but because of this single-minded obsession with balancing the books. And Michigan changed Flint's water source from Detroit to the Flint River. And then we know what happened next, right? The old pipes leaked lead and other toxins into the drinking water, poisoning the town, and the human costs of this totally preventable disaster were enormous, especially for the children, many of whom face long-term health complications still, right? So it's not possible to promote, eudaimonia or spiritual flourishing if your community cannot even deliver a safe environment with clean drinking water. All right, lastly, consider the city of Ferguson, Missouri, where massive protests and rebellions swept through the city in 2014, right? The same year as Flint. Now, up until 1970, Ferguson, Missouri was about 99% white and 1% black, right? That was in 1970. Then, as a result of decades of deindustrialization and corresponding white flight, Ferguson is now about 70% black. Decades of deindustrialization in Ferguson, along with that white flight, undermined the city's economy and eroded its tax base. So, what did Ferguson city officials do to make up for that lost tax revenue? Well, they implemented new fines, costly court fees, and they directed the police to implement hyper-aggressive policing tactics to generate revenue. And the results were patently racist, as Ferguson began to fund 1/4 of its entire operating budget by using the police to plunder the wealth from its black citizens. So we had a scenario in which 16 out of 21,000 people had outstanding arrest warrants for things like traffic violations, not violent crimes. All right, black residents in Ferguson were getting tickets for manner of walking in the roadway, for having grass that was too high in their yards, and 14 other types of trivial parking violations. At the same time, black residents in Ferguson were twice as likely as whites to be stopped by the police, twice as likely as whites to be searched for contraband, twice as likely as whites to receive a citation, twice as likely as whites to be arrested when stopped. Yet at the same time, Ferguson's black residents were 26% less likely than whites to be found with contraband when they were stopped. And so the U.S. Department of Justice investigated Ferguson right after all of the protests, and they highlighted the fact that city and police leadership were pressuring officers to write citations independent of any public safety need and to rely on that citation to fund the city budget. So that's been happening for a decade, maybe longer. Then in 2014, a Ferguson police officer murdered an unarmed black teenager named Mike Brown. Thousands and thousands of people came out to the streets protesting rebellion, and they had decided it was time to drive the police out of their neighborhoods, right? And it's true, there was much looting during this rebellion in Ferguson. But what we have to keep in mind was that for years and years, the Ferguson police force, which was also all white and lived outside of the town of Ferguson, had been looting wealth from Ferguson's poor black residents. So black folks in Ferguson, right, they had to sort of every day negotiate this obstacle course of police harassment and police suspicion. Like it was a part of their daily lives. So of course, the city was primed to explode. The murder of Mike Brown was just a catalyst for this explosion, right? And this isn't unique to Ferguson, right? This happens all over the country. It's one of the reasons why after the murder of George Floyd, we saw city after city people take to the streets in rebellion, right? Because you've got this entire history of different forms of political and economic exploitation that drives people to rebel once there's a catalyzing event, right? So again, we can find plenty of examples of places like Flint, places like in Ferguson, where a community isn't meeting even the most minimal requirements for human flourishing and the good life. All right, so that's the end of this lecture. I'll try to have a third one up soon. Thanks.